Okay, I believe we are live. Hello and welcome to live programming at the More Freedom Foundation. If you're new to this, the way this works is I give a sort of presentation, talk about something that I really want to talk about, and then hopefully, I think this one might be pretty long. I've got a lot to go through, but within half hour to an hour, maybe even a little more than an hour. After that, I'll go dive into the live chat and start answering questions from the live audience. I don't have the mental bandwidth to sort of look at those comments as they're happening as I'm presenting. So please be civil to each other. You are more than welcome to be as vicious to me as you want. Also, if you ask a question in that live chat, I won't be able to sort of go back. So once I announce that the sort of Q&A period is starting, please answer your questions again. So just hold on to those. And I hope a spirited discussion throughout this. And yeah, once again, please be civil to each other. So today I'm going live for my Tuesday video because a Yemen video that I was writing sort of got away from me a bit. I'm not sure exactly what I want to do, and it requires more research and sort of diving into legal bills, into actual laws, the National Defense Authorization that deals with Yemen requirements, unlike the details of the State Department. But anyway, I was sort of defeated by it, and I hope to get that video out either later this week or next Tuesday. But I'm actually kind of grateful that this happened, that sort of my planning got screwed up, because it allows me to dive into a question I've been thinking about really almost constantly, and that's the question of oil prices and electric cars, actually, and how I may have screwed up in some of the predictions that I have made on this channel, and how I may be okay on those predictions anyway because of certain other things. Anyway, I'm about to get into it, and I'm grateful that I get to dive into this, because I think the live format's the right thing for this, because it's all sort of up in the air. It's a bit wishy-washy, and if I tried to do this in a produced video form, it would be what I did that month. So I'm excited to get this information out there, and I hope you enjoy it. So the question, the basic question is, are oil prices about to spike? Are they higher than they used to be? And was I wrong about predictions that I've made about the oil market? I think there are two main predictions that I've made about the oil price and what it means for geopolitics. The first was back in 2016, I think early 2016, I stated that the decline in oil prices would lead to a fall in Islamic terrorism. Sorry, radical Islamic terrorism, jihadi terrorism. There's a whole bunch of arguments over what the appropriate language is to use for that, but I apologize to anyone I've offended, whatever. So that prediction has absolutely come true. I was going to do, I'm sort of plotting an out of their update video on that. Even the most Islamophobic of places, there's a website called the Religion of Peace that very sarcastically calls itself the Religion of Peace, and keeps track of, keeps a running list of all the events that could plausibly be considered to be terrorism motivated by radical Islam. And one of the embarrassing things about this website is that I identified this in the video last year, is that it's plummeting. The sort of the Islamophobic website is documenting how these acts of terror are actually plummeting year by year. So yeah, that has largely come true. But if oil prices are going to go back up, if oil prices are going to spike, does that mean that's going to stop being true? I don't think so. I'll get into that a whole bunch later on. The other prediction that I made in April of 2017 is that Saudi Arabia is finished, specifically because of this new lower oil price environment. And I think I definitely believe that to be true, even with the stuff I'm going to be talking about today, how there actually might be an oil price spike coming, a real oil price spike coming. I still believe that very much to be the case, and I'll cover that as well. So oil prices are pretty important. And, in the 2016 video, the oil prices were around, I think, $45 a barrel, something like that. When I made the Saudi Arabia video last year, they'd gotten up into the 50s. And now, as of today, there's two different sort of main prices that people look at. The Brent crude prices have now topped $80 a barrel again. And I think the WTI, the West Texas Intermediate, has topped $70 a barrel. It's sort of trading, around there. Now, I think the first thing to point out is like, okay, so has this already been a dramatic rise in oil prices? Has this already been a dramatic spike in oil prices that proves me wrong? I would say absolutely not. And I think the problem here is the way that these things are reported. There's a whole vast industry, not just in petrostates like Saudi Arabia or petrostates like the United States, that's really invested in oil prices going back up again. I'm thinking of oil traders. I'm thinking of journalists whose careers depend on oil being this tremendously important thing that we look into. So you'll see a lot of headlines that say, oil prices reach record, reach 4-year highs, 3-year highs, 2-year highs. And I think it's very important that, so the headlines there sort of should indicate to you that there's something else going on there, because the reason they never talk about more than 4-year highs is that oil prices are dramatically lower than they were in 2014 and continue to be there. And these sort of incredible highs that keep getting talked about and spikes and this, that, and the other thing still have an oil price per barrel that's nowhere near sort of where the oil price normally was in the period between 2008 and 2014. So we're still dealing with low oil prices, and that's sort of the defense that I've used when people have brought things up. But I think as we get into the 80s and 90s, which is possible. I mean, we're still just cresting the 80s and cresting the 70s in Brent and cresting the 70s in WTI. I think it's important for me to revise a little bit. And because of a number of different events, I think it's definitely worth revising. And so I'm going to sort of talk about that right now. I had a video talking about oil prices, about how Saudi Arabia is still finished about 5 months back, where I talked about some of the sort of perfect storm of things that have happened that have contributed to rising oil prices. But I thought, I don't think I've ever actually done this before, but I think it's worth talking about sort of the total production of the world. It's interesting because, I get different statistics on this, but apparently in a given day, it's somewhere between 80 and 93 million barrels of oil are produced. Now, probably it's the export figures that are more important, because a lot of that stuff, the United States is the largest producer with somewhere between 10 and 13 million barrels of oil per day. But the vast majority of that is consumed within the United States. So, this is another thing. But I think that of this sort of 80 to 90 million barrels of oil that are produced, tons of it, probably I don't know if it's accurate to say the majority of it, but I think it might be, is consumed by the countries that produce it, or sort of in their local markets. So that means that it's not 93 million. It's a smaller amount of that, maybe 20 to 40 million barrels of oil a day. That production is what determines all these markets, what really, really matters. So as I documented in that video 5 months back, we've had a crazy series of outages. Libya since 2014. I mean, sometimes they come back, sometimes they go down, but that's as much as 1 million barrels of daily production that's just not there anymore. I mean, sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. That's gone. Venezuela, which I talked about just a couple of weeks back, has lost, and that's not something that's going up and going down. It has been a steady loss and a plummet of 1 to 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. Nigeria often has serious problems. I mean, this is all, so any one of those sort of $1 million barrel issues should be enough, and it would have been enough prior to 2014 or prior to 2008, would have been enough to send oil into the stratosphere. But it hasn't, because I think because of the dynamics I talk about on this channel, because the oil market has really changed in a significant way. But I do believe that I do now believe that it's possible, not necessarily likely, it's possible that I was very wrong about my confident assertions that oil could never get back up to 100 or would never be. Well, I was certainly wrong that it wouldn't stay above 60 for long, or whatnot. But I do believe that it's possible that we could briefly get back to the kinds of prices that we were paying in 2014. So why do I think that? The first very large reason I think that is Iran. Now, I go back and forth on this. Basically, Iran is now sanctioned again. Iran is a monster oil producer. So I was talking about how Venezuela's plummet from 2.5 million barrels of oil a day down to 1.3 has made a huge difference. Iran produces 3.8, or rather, it did at its high point produce 3.8 million barrels of oil a day. It has now fallen to 3.1 due to sanctions activity. My understanding is that the sanctions on Iran's oil just rolled out in the past month or so, and it's still shaking out what is going to happen. I do not believe that Iranian production will plummet as far as the market currently assumes it will, but I do believe that it is possible. I mean, it's already fallen from 3.8 to 3.1. It could go down to 2.1. So the Iranian regime is not going to be destroyed by Trump's sanctions, but the world oil market losing another million barrels of oil a day could very well get us back to that $90 a barrel, $90 a barrel, $100 a barrel, maybe 110, but I kind of doubt it. So Iran is a very serious issue. There's another issue that I think is actually a lot more serious than Iran, because I don't think Iranian production is going to fall as much as people are forecasting, and that is the shale patch. That is U.S. oil production. There was a great article in the New York Times, I believe it was September 1st, by Bethany McLean, talking about how the next financial crisis might lurk underground. I think that headline is a little overdone, but the article in the New York Times includes a lot of really important information that I've definitely been sort of aware of in the back of my head, but she really draws it all together in a way that's pretty interesting. So the standard story, trumpeted by really everybody, is that the United States is getting to a point of oil security, and it is now the largest oil producer in the world. Whereas from the 1970s or so, oil production in the United States had been falling. There was a sort of technological revolution starting around 2000, 2002 or so, where there's actually one guy in particular, I can't recall his name, that came up with sort of fracking technologies, directional drilling, there's a whole host of things. I think the closer you look at these dynamics, the less useful and descriptive terms like shale oil or shale gas or fracking become useful. But there has been a technological revolution, and the United States has gone from producing something like 7 million barrels of oil a day that was all consumed by the United States plus a whole bunch of exports to 11, 12. I actually saw one figure that said 13 million barrels of oil a day had been produced in the United States, which is pretty extraordinary, and we're now exporting petroleum products again. So that's the shale revolution, and how this has really made the big difference, and this, that, and the other thing. And it has. That's absolutely true. I mean, that is what's happened. That is the main thing that has happened to oil markets over the past 10 years. But this article in the New York Times, and I'd recommend that you all go read it. It's by Bethany McLean. Talks about how the next financial crisis lurks underground, I believe is what it is. I'd recommend you all go read that, because it consolidates a lot of really useful information. And the central piece of that article is that these folks aren't making any money. These companies that have been doing such incredible work driving up U.S. oil production aren't actually profitable. They're not making money and they don't have to, because of the same assumption that keeps Saudi Arabia afloat today. Everyone just assumes despite it now being 4 years since we've seen sort of 2014 style oil prices. Despite it being 4 years since then, everybody assumes we're going to get there. We're absolutely going to get there for sure. That's where oil prices belong. Now, while I think we could actually get there briefly, I do not believe that that is where oil prices belong. But the financial types, the Wall Street types, who've been pouring money, endless money, into these oil fields and many different companies in Texas, the Dakotas, throughout the country, they're operating on that same assumption that the 2014 prices are where things belong. And for 4 years, they've been getting their asses kicked. There are people who, as the article points out, there are people who have made money off of this, but that's more, there are Wall Street people who've made money off of this, but that's by buying and selling these companies, flipping them back and forth. Nobody's really dealt with the underlying issue here. Now, we're talking about dozens of different companies. We're talking about, some of them quite possibly are profitable, are doing very well, but not the majority. The article also points out that same low interest rate environment that is changing, that is causing so many troubles for Turkey, Argentina, and other emerging economies, is also a huge factor in this fracking revolution, in this shale revolution. The reason that they've been able to not make any money for so long and just take on more and more debt is because interest rates have been so low. As those go up, the shale patch becomes endangered. Now, it's not like these technologies are going to disappear. It's not like these, like the shale and the fracking and all that is not going to continue to occupy this position where it provides a ceiling to oil prices. It absolutely will. I mean, it's not like these technologies are going to go away. They can actually be applied in more places. And if we do actually get back to 2014 prices, they're going to be one of the factors that means that we don't stay there because these technologies exist. But I think what this article does and points out very, very interestingly is that it's not going to be at the same scale, especially if we don't get on that oil price spike. The sort of shale revolution in the United States is just as reliable as Saudi Arabia is on this idea that oil prices are going to go back to where they were 4 years ago. And they're not for any length of time. So people are not going to make that kind of money in the shale patch. And it is a bubble situation. It is a situation where I believe people are now beginning to realize this. So it's weird because it's self-feeding. It sort of goes in a bit of a circle. It's well, shit, if we all decide that the shale patch isn't a good investment, then prices will go up and it will become a good investment. And so, yeah, it's a very dynamic thing, but I don't believe that oil prices will go up for any sustainable period of time. So the shale revolution just is sort of on a feet of sand, feet of clay, is sort of standing in quicksand. And I think that's something to be very aware of. Now, I do not think that U.S. oil production is going to go back down to 7 million barrels a day. It's not going to be that bad. But will it stay at 13? I think absolutely not. I mean, maybe it'll fall back down to 10. I mean, the United States is now producing so much that it can actually remain the largest oil producer in the world and lose 2 million barrels of capacity, which would create exactly that sort of oil price spike. So I think that's something. So, Iran sanctions are an issue, sort of standard outages and whatnot. The OPEC deal with Russia is a big issue. But I think the central reason why a spike in oil prices is possible is actually because of weakness in the U.S. shale patch. So that's what I'm worried about. I'm not actually, I really don't think that the Iran sanctions are going to take off that much more capacity. I just saw on Twitter that the EU, China, and Russia, and I think some other important actors have all gotten together to figure out a way to work around the U.S. financial system and keep buying Iranian oil. I do not think Trump is going to be anywhere near as successful with these sanctions as Obama was, and as Trump thinks he will be. But it's the shale patch that makes me think that actually we might see a spike in oil prices. Let's see. So yeah, I think I may have been wrong about this. Yep, I think I've made it through here. The important thing with the shale patch is that even if there is a spike, that spike probably won't last for the reasons that I've talked about, which makes them just not a very good investment. Which I think the smart money is known for a number of years now. And if I'm becoming aware of it, then we got some real problems. So if the shale patch isn't going to work anymore, does this make Saudi Arabia more important? Does this mean that Saudi Arabia is going to, keep on going forever and be fine? No, I do not think that is the case because Saudi Arabia, and especially after these 4 years of taking on debt and going on these massive buying sprees and inventing, new mega cities that will never be built or never be built to the outsized expectations that they've come up with. I do not think that even if there is a spike in oil prices, I do not think it will save Saudi Arabia. It's just not going to happen. And to the other question of will there now be all kinds of discretionary funds for more terrorism stuff from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar? I also think the answer to that is no. There's limited sort of savvy in certainly limited savvy in investing, macroeconomic savvy or intelligence in Saudi Arabia. There's more in the UAE and Qatar, or Qatar. So I think that these folks are smart enough to know that they're in a period of financial retrenchment if there's an oil spike. I think that they're smart enough to know that they need to try and pay off some of the debts they've accrued, and I think that they won't just have this discretionary funding to hose towards every terrorist group in the world anymore. I don't think that's going to develop. So while I do think that there are folks in Saudi Arabia who are smart enough to perhaps use some of a potential oil price spike windfall to pay off some of these old debts and rebuild some of their reserves, I don't think that they're smart enough to do it in a large scale fashion. I think that a spike in oil prices would be something that would allow Saudi Arabia to retrench a little bit, but it would also encourage them to discard all of the reforms that they've half-heartedly tried to make. I think it's fair to say, even at this point, that most of what Saudi Arabia has been planning in the Vision 2030 thing has been some variety of no, okay, not everything has been a disastrous failure. Saudi Arabia has taken some real steps away from radical extremist government. These steps have not been anywhere near far enough to encourage the kinds of investment that they think they deserve, and also actions taken by the Saudi government, arresting all their rich people and taking their money, for one, have also made it unlikely that they're going to get any of the investment that they think they're going to get. But in the context of a spike in oil prices, then Saudi Arabia has an incentive to get even less serious. And the Saudi Arabian people are even less willing to accept, will be even less willing to accept the cuts in government spending, the cuts in government benefits that are absolutely essential for Saudi Arabia's continued survival. So I think actually a brief spike in oil prices might even accelerate Saudi Arabia's decline, because they would lose what little momentum they have towards reform. So yeah, I think that while I think it is possible that there will be a brief spike in oil prices, I do not think this will really undermine my sort of central predictions around this. I believe that radical Islamic terrorism, mostly funded by the Gulf countries, will continue to fall. And I also believe that Saudi Arabia itself will be a completely different country by 2030. All right. So let's talk about why I think a spike would be brief. I think that the remnants of the shale patch will act as a governor on prices. We're not going to we're not going to get into the 120s or 130s, which is, where we'd need to be to be talking about Saudi Arabia's long-term viability again, because of shale stuff. But there's also a lot of other stuff. We've already seen the impact that the sort of steady, slow rise in oil prices we've seen over the past couple of years has had in India. India already is talking about just sort of backing out. I'm not 100% sure, but India already has been slowing down its purchases in response to just the demand that we've gotten. China is a little less responsive on that, just because China has a lot more money, has a lot more discretionary funds to continue buying oil that is necessary. They're not going to be, unlike India, they're not going to instantly sacrifice sort of any oil-related living standards just because it goes up by $10. But they are already spending tens of billions of dollars a year to try and liberate themselves from petroleum products more generally. Or exported petroleum products, as they've put tens of billions of dollars into electric cars. There are over 1 million electric cars on the road in China now, and that's growing very, very quickly. They're going big into solar and wind and this, that, and the other thing. And also with China and also with India, if oil prices go through the roof, they have an incentive to just go back to coal. And that's a really sad thing to happen from a climate change or emissions perspective, if that's something that you're into. But coal, which is sort of declining or plummeting, or almost certainly not quite disappearing. Actually, oil consumption is still just barely growing, though I think it's below 2013 levels at this point. I think I remember that from something I read this morning. But coal is still there. So if we do shoot up in oil prices, then there are a lot of meaningful ways and ways that are growing every day to substitute oil and substitute coal again for oil and natural gas. So what's important about China and India is that these two countries, and these two countries almost completely alone, are where the growth in demand is expected to come from for every oil exporter. So everybody from Exxon to Saudi Arabia, ExxonMobil, big U.S. oil and gas company, to Saudi Arabia, is completely reliant on what happens in the Indian and Chinese markets for petroleum products. That's where all the growth is expected to be. That's where everybody's projections are depending on. And we've already seen with India that it's fallen. Their demand has fallen. I'm not sure if, or rather maybe it's just the growth in their demand has fallen, but it has had a serious impact that has fed back into prices. This slow creep up of oil prices over the past 3 years has had already had a serious impact on Indian demand, and it has another, perhaps further order along, impact on Chinese demand as well. So that's sort of one of the reasons why I believe this price spike, if there is a price spike coming, will be brief. Because India and China simply won't grow the way that they're projected to grow if we're back at $100 a barrel of oil. Rather, the demand for oil, and also, yes, aggregate growth for these countries, which makes all of us a little more invested in lower oil prices, which I think makes Trump's chicanery with Iran even dumber. But why go into that right now? Let's keep this nonpartisan. Now, speaking about nonpartisan, I think I'm going to get to. Well, actually, first let's talk about the U.S. baseload. A figure I read this morning, which kind of surprised me, because China has surpassed the United States on a number of metrics. But actually, I think probably because of how important the car is to U.S. culture. I mean, I love a good long road trip. I've probably driven 50 or 60 hours myself over this summer, and I was just using mom and dad's car. I don't even own one. But the car is very important to U.S. culture. Oil, whatnot. I was surprised to see this because China has exceeded the U.S. in so many metrics, but apparently the U.S. still consumes 19 million barrels of oil a day, whereas China only consumes 12 million barrels of oil a day, which is fascinating. So while all the growth comes from India and China, what happens in the United States is what's very, very important. The United States, it is, essentially a quarter of oil, of daily oil consumption. And don't trust me on those figures. It's amazing. Looking at figures for this stuff can be very confusing because all kinds of people use different metrics and approaches. Maybe that 19 million includes ethanol or this, that, and the other thing. It's don't take these numbers as gospel. Do your own research if you're interested in this sort of thing. But I think I can say with confidence that the United States still consumes a lot more oil than China does. So the U.S. is tremendously important to these oil markets. And what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is the return of the sport utility vehicle. In the United States, I think famously, one of the things that killed the U.S. Auto industry in 2006, 2007, 2008, and required a bailout was the fact that the only thing the United States car companies, the actual U.S. car producers, did well anymore was produce SUVs, large sport utility vehicles, basically large vehicles that fit into this weird emissions and fuel economy exception for sport utility vehicles. Like supposedly these are big Jeeps and trucks that you ride over. That you see the car ads of those big big sporty cars driving through the West, so through deserts or something, this, that, and the other thing. So these sport utility vehicles that suck up a lot more gas became the most, one of the largest sectors of the car market, and was the only real sector of the car market that the U.S. car companies were any good at making anymore. So when oil prices spiked back in 2008, this market essentially disappeared. Everybody started buying smaller cars. And the U.S. car industry, I think Ford actually made it through without having a dramatic blow up, but the other two cars had to be bailed out by all the other two U.S. car companies had to be bailed out by the U.S. government because nobody was buying sport utility vehicles anymore. Now, for the past 4 years, coming up on 5 years, we've been living in a cheaper oil environment. The gas prices in the United States, the price at the pump hasn't gone down as far as perhaps it should be, considering what happened to perhaps considering what happened to the oil prices. But it's gone down. It's gotten lower. And you know what? We in the United States, we like big cars. I can even think of just friends and family that I know. They just bought. They rather than having a small sedan or like a 4-door car, they've got another sort of Jeep-like thing with another just massive big chunk of metal. And that's what's happened in the U.S. market over the past 4 or 5 years. Folks are buying less fuel-efficient cars because so if there was an oil price spike, this behavior would change very, very quickly. And that's why such an oil price spike would not be sustained. You'd very quickly find people who are more interested in, now even I'm going to talk about electric cars at some length shortly, but even if the electric cars thing never happened and never materialized, were oil prices to go back over $100 or whatnot, the SUV thing would disappear. It would be millions of car buyers in the United States simply making a decision. Well, crap, I can't, at $4 or $5 a gallon of oil. This is sorry, at $4 or $5 per gallon of gasoline for my car. I'm not going to buy another freaking SUV that cost me $50 to $100 to fill up. I'm going to buy a smaller car, or maybe I'll buy a hybrid, or maybe I'll think about this electric car thing. But even if the electric car thing doesn't happen, if it's the complete myth that everybody pretends it is, U.S. cars will get smaller very quickly. And that crucial demand of the U.S. oil, the U.S. consumer of gasoline, will go down very quickly. That's why I believe that any spike in prices would be unsustainable. All right. So now let's get into electric cars. I'm actually, the title of this video talks about a big bang in electric cars, and that's exactly what I believe a spike in oil prices would provide. It would provide the big bang for electric cars. And now with electric cars, I've really been looking into this stuff a lot, and I may actually do some videos on them, more produced videos on this particular topic. But electric cars is one of those things where a lot of us believe something that just isn't true. If you go back to my 2016 video where I talk about, I think it's like how oil prices will end, how the fall in oil prices will end Islamic terrorism or something like that. I'll put a link in the description. I talked briefly about Tesla, and I'm like more of a ha, 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 electric cars. Sure, yeah, that's, if this happens, I'm very dismissive of the idea of electric cars. And what's interesting is if you read a lot on the subject, you can still find a lot of people who believe that very firmly, that sort of electric cars are this pie in the sky technology that's never really going to happen. And it only exists because people subsidize it so much. I mean, this is just ridiculous. And, aren't there more emissions because of electric cars anyway? Like, this is some kind of stupid California, Norway bullshit. And I was very sympathetic to that. Certainly 5 years ago, that was what I thought of electric cars. 2 years ago, when I made that video, I was like, I was getting a little suspicious. I'm becoming quite convinced that electric cars are about to become, or are already becoming, a big, big thing. And what's extraordinary about that is that, remember, I'm talking about how most or the majority of US car buyers have been buying SUVs over the past 5 years. That's probably an overstatement, but a trend in the US car market over the past 5 years is, whoa, oil prices don't cost anything. Let's go buy SUVs. And one of the things that I assumed would happen in 2014, I was like, oh shit, well, I believe in climate change. I want lower emissions. So I was always, though not believing in it, a fan of the idea of electric cars. So in 2014, 2015, I was like, oh shit, well, there goes electric cars. Oil doesn't cost anything anymore. Why would anybody buy an electric car? But that's not what's happened over the past 5 years. Maybe it's the way that climate change has become such a huge part of the way we think. Maybe it's because people were so scarred by the run up in oil prices in 2008 and what that did to so many people's gas tanks. But even in the context of historically low oil prices, the electric car market has been booming. This actually does have a lot to do with one man. This has a lot to do with Elon Musk, who founded an electric car company called Tesla. Now, I actually think that there's a distinct chance that Elon Musk will lose Tesla over the next year because of some really dumb things he said about taking the company private. And if Elon Musk is gone, I mean, Tesla's going to evaporate. But that doesn't necessarily, actually, no, that absolutely does not matter, because what Tesla did, what Elon Musk created, was fear in all of these other car manufacturers. And not just Elon Musk and Tesla, but also the fact that more and more governments, most importantly, the California state government and a range of European governments led by Norway, decided they wanted electric cars. So we're now in an environment where almost every serious car manufacturer has either launched and is selling, or at least has plans on the drawing board for electric cars. I don't think people have really quite internalized what a huge switch that is, because that was the thing with electric cars forever. I mean, there have been electric cars since the 1890s. My understanding is actually the electric cars came on stream before the internal combustion engines, actually. It's a very old technology. There was a famous documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, talking about the way that oil companies and car companies would never let the electric car really become a thing. Well, they failed. The electric car is a real thing. There's a lot of, there's plug-in electrics, there are hybrids, there are plug-in hybrids. I think most of the figures I'm about to go through actually consider all of those together. But I mean, just flat out electric cars are a real thing. They are all over the place. And if Tesla disappears, in the next year or two, which is a possibility. I don't think a likelihood, but a possibility. We're still in the era of the electric car. You've got, I mean, every day or every week, there's a new headline about a car company rolling out another electric car. And there are still very real reasons why they're not being widely adopted. The fact is that not just with the luxury sedans or the Tesla or Audi electrics or this, that, and the other thing, but even the most bargain basement sort of Nissan Leaf, isn't that the big cheap electric car? The economic picture isn't there yet. It doesn't make sense. And even with many of the subsidies that governments provide, if you buy an electric car, you're going to pay more than all the money you would save from oil. So that's a very, very real reason that people don't like electric cars. Batteries are becoming more and more of a stumbling block because as demand sort of shoots up, we have to find more and more sources for lithium and all these other components, and that's proving to be difficult. What's the other one? Range. Range is really important. I would not buy an electric car because I like really long road trips. I would, if I were ever in the position to buy a car, I would probably buy a plug-in hybrid because I need the versatility of the ability to drive long distances. But the range is expanding with each new model, with each new year, with each new million cars that is on the road. All of these problems become smaller. So we've got this situation now where we have a growing network of charging stations. We have well over 4 million electric or plug-in or this, that, and the other cars on the road throughout the world. We've got governments like China, Norway, California, other governments throughout the world that are really sort of hard charging for this, but it still just keeps not happening. It's like everything is there, like all these forces are just sort of building up and waiting. And what would cause the big bang? What would make that happen? A spike in oil prices. So if we actually got, the electric cars are easy things to mock, easy things to, and you can poo-poo electric cars with things that were true 4 years ago. Absolutely, they're only viable with subsidies. They're only viable with this, but the thing is, once you get into mass manufacturing and competition and whatnot, all of these problems will get solved very, very quickly. And in the context of an oil price spike, the main problem gets solved immediately. I haven't done the math. It'd be great if somebody who's more mathematically inclined or could find the right article could point out, like, a Nissan Leaf isn't viable at $40 a barrel of oil. But you could save a lot of money with a Nissan Leaf circa 2020 with a larger range and this, that, and the other thing, if oil prices are at $100, $100 per barrel of oil. So I really think that this is something that could potentially be very, very big. And were I an investor, I'd actually start looking into electric cars. Certainly not Tesla. I think that stock is overpriced or is just a roller coaster ride. But I'd look into Chinese manufacturers of electric cars, which are the largest in the world. I think there's a distinct chance that we're going to see this electric car big bang very shortly. And there could be an oil price spike that Saudi Arabia and the other funders of terror could benefit from. But it would probably be the last oil price spike. That's a silly statement. It would be the last oil price spike that Saudi Arabia would benefit from. Because if you study the sort of petroleum markets in any kind of historical context, you can say for sure that they will go up again, they will go down again. What's really important, though, is the range within which those go up or down. Though I may have been a little over-optimistic in my assumption that we were going to have, super low bargain basement oil prices for the rest of the decade, I do believe that we still remain in the lower for longer oil price environment. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. There's just a couple figures I wanted to go into. So Norway, I think 30% of all new car sales are electric cars. Now, Norway you cannot make any kind of larger prediction off of Norway because Norway is the most aggressive. There's like all kinds of like tax rebates. I mean, the Norwegian government is paying, I don't know, 10, 20 grand for every electric car on its road. And because the Norwegian government and the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has almost limitless funding, they're happy to do that. So Norway is not, a leading indicator. But the fact that Norway, a serious European country of 5 to 10 million Norwegians or something like that, is rolling out this technology and beginning to show what it would actually look like, it becomes very much easier to apply. It's much easier to be the second country that goes whole hog for electric vehicles. I don't think people, while it's easy to poo-poo the Norwegian example, I don't think people are really thinking through like, well, holy crap, like, so at this rate, then 10 years from now, like something like 70 to 80% of the cars on the Norwegian road are going to be electric, which means just sort of automatically this sort of technology and approach is going to spread to Sweden and Finland and Denmark, if they're not already trying to build that, and then it'll spread down to Germany. And this is yes, Norway is not an indicator of what's happening right now, or a realistic estimation of the potential of electric cars, but it is very significant technologically, and what it means for the solution to these problems of range and charging and cost. That's a huge deal. I mean, so the Norwegian fleet of cars is what, 5 to 10 million cars. If those are all electric, which seem not all, but 70 or 80% electric, which seems very possible within the next 10 years. That means Norway will have more electric cars 10 years from now than the entire electric car fleet of the world. And when we see how quickly the technological issues are fading away, with 4 million, I believe that's the appropriate figure. There's about 4 million electric cars on the road right now. What's it going to be like when there's 40 million, which will happen probably just in Europe within the next 10 years. That's pretty extraordinary. Another figure that I wanted to look at, so California, in the first half of 2018, 10% of all new car sales were either electric, plug-in, hybrid, or hybrid cars. That's, once again, California is an extreme subsidy state, but it's nowhere near on the same level of Norway. And that is 10% of new car sales. I mean, it'll take, at that rate, it would take decades for that to make a real impact on, it would take, well, a decade to make a real impact on, the fleet of cars that is being used in California. But that's not going to slow down. That's going to get higher. And one the crazy one is the United Kingdom, which doesn't have the money to do any kind of the subsidy regime anywhere near on the same level as Norway or California. In August, 8% of its new car sales were electric. I'm not sure if that's electric or electric plug-in hybrid. That's probably electric, plug-in hybrid and hybrid vehicles. But yeah, that's 8% in a country that doesn't actually have a lot of the same subsidy stuff. I mean, and the reason that the BBC posted for that was rising oil prices. And that's slowly rising oil prices. So yeah, I really do think that the electric car big bang would be a spike in oil prices, which would, by its very nature, mean that spike in oil prices would not be long lasting. All right. Well, I did that in an hour and 20 minutes. I think that's kind of fascinating and hopeful. And also, yes, I was wrong to a degree. Okay. So who's got questions? Who has got questions? Logo Cool Extreme asks, is California a wealthy, successful state or a failed one with high levels of poverty and homelessness? I would definitely say, well, the simple answer is both. But I would actually say it is a wealthy, successful state, vastly more than it is a failed one with high levels of poverty and homelessness. The key thing to understand about cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon, I guess I don't know. Does Seattle have the same issues, or maybe a little too northerly and a little too cold? But the important thing to remember about the homeless crisis, that of course nobody working for Fox News will ever tell you. The important thing to remember about the homelessness crisis in California and Oregon is because these cities and states are so liberal in every sense of the word with their benefits for homeless people. I have some connections in the recovery community, and I knew that it was sort of a known thing that if you wanted to sober up, you just had to move to Oregon for a year, because if you got your year's residency, they'd pay for all of your treatment, which is an extraordinary thing in the United States, where essentially nothing with healthcare is free. So the reason that San Francisco is such a nightmare, and I have friends who live in San Francisco, and the understanding is that crime and homelessness is reaching crisis proportions there. The reason is because everybody's homeless from across the entire country go to San Francisco, California, and Portland, Oregon. And I think that speaks very highly of California and Oregon, that they continue to provide these benefits when it's quite clear that they're actually picking up the sort of social costs of the entire country. So yeah, I think this idea that California is somehow failing is idiotic. What's interesting is that California, circa 2008, I think had one of the worst crises in terms of just the state balance sheet. California is, I would absolutely agree, way too generous to the folks who work for the state of California. So, 2008, Fox News, National Review, all the sort of conservative news outlets were running with, oh my God, California's guaranteed failure. It's all going to hell. Look at these dumb hippies. They can't run a balance sheet. California actually grew its way out of that crisis. I do believe that their balance sheet is still unsustainable and whatnot, but they're making plenty of money. Trump is super excited because he got a single quarter of growth at 4%. I believe California, all of 2017, annualized, not one quarter, was over 4 or 5%. One of the reasons that Trump has growth figures that he can trump in is because of California. I assure you, it's not. It's Texas to a degree. I'm not sure how long that's going to be a red state, but it ain't fucking Wyoming and South Dakota or Wilson, I don't know, North Dakota that. Or Alabama that are driving the growth figures that Trump is proud of. It's California primarily. So no, California is not a failed state. What you did in Iran. Okay, Salah seems very angry. Huskan says, so Tesla is not going in debt. Actually, no, Tesla is very much in debt, and it's an open question whether Tesla can continue to fund its production. The rise in interest rates hurts everybody. Tesla has taken on a lot of debt over the past 4 or 5 years. So that's an open question. I love Tesla as a company. I think it's fascinating. I admire Elon Musk greatly, but I'm not at all confident that Tesla will survive the coming years. However, people have counted Elon Musk out before, so I'm hopeful that it'll come together. Can Chinese and Russian threaten petrodollar? If yes, when you expect fall of petrodollar? Yeah, the whole fall of petrodollar thing, I think, is pretty overblown. Saudi Arabia is way too invested in the United States. It's basically a U.S. colony for that actually to be seriously threatened. In the post-Saudi royal family world, then, things get a little more interesting. But, we've seen over and over, Venezuela and the petro. Lots of folks want to buy and sell petroleum in something other than dollars, but it's complicated and it's difficult. We're still in a sweet spot in the United States. So the petrodollar idea is that the U.S. currency somehow depends on the fact that people buy a lot of stuff in oil and buy a lot of oil and petroleum products in dollars, even outside of the United States. This is something that could dissipate over the next 5, 10 years. The thing is, were something to happen, were oil markets and whatnot to change so dramatically that the dollar was no longer the reserve currency, where would it go? Seriously, what currency would be the reserve currency at this point? The euro? The Chinese renminbi? As many challenges as there are for the United States, sort of macroeconomically, future facing this, that, and the other thing, the problems that face the euro area and the Chinese economy are vastly larger. I think there's a distinct chance of a financial crisis in the United States in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe next week. But I think that's unlikely at this point, but it's possible. But I think there is a almost certain serious financial crisis that shakes the government and shakes the system that they live under in China within the next 10, 20 years. I think that's almost a certainty. So who's going to want to, I mean, sure, I think if people made a concerted effort, they could move away from the dollar in oil transactions. But it's not like you can just sort of flip a switch and then automatically there's a new world reserve currency. And in fact, if there was, we saw this in 2008, when things went weird, and shifting the sort of petrodollar calculus is definitely an example of things going weird. When things got weird, even though it was the U.S. housing market that blew up and the U.S. banks that were in danger of failing, everybody rushed into U.S. treasuries. I mean, it's screwed up. But yeah, the U.S. has tremendous dividends from being powerful. Now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, China comes out of the other end of its crisis with a better form of government and an even more rampaging and dominant economy, then yeah, absolutely. I think this petrodollar stuff becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more important. And yeah, we could end up with the petro renminbi or something like that, and that would seriously undermine the United States. But that's not a next week, 5 year, 10 year thing. That's actually another thing that makes me think we need to deal with Saudi Arabia as soon as possible, because we're still in, from the petrodollar perspective, we're still in that moment where there's nowhere else for anybody to go in terms of reserve currency. Okay. Oil price will obviously spike and rising, but how will this affect Russia? I wouldn't go quite that far, Goat Lover. Great title. But I don't think it's obviously going to spike and rise. I think it's rising slowly. It might spike, but it could also just as easily fall. And yeah, obviously that'd be great for Russia. Putin's in some serious trouble right now, I believe, related to some pension reform that he's had to make. And the way we talk about Russia in the United States is just such bullshit. Russia's been, I believe, for the past couple of years, has been slashing its defense industry and defense budgets because it just can't afford it. They're now revising pensions that date back to the Soviet times because they can't afford it. So yes, absolutely. A rise in oil prices, I think it already has helped secure Russia a bit more. But it's also interesting is that it indicates, just how little this rise from $40 to $80 a barrel has done. Even though over the past 3 years the trend has been up, Russia still has to reform its pensions. So yeah, a spike in oil prices would be great for Russia. And I think Russia would do a better job than really anybody else benefiting from that. So yeah. Let's see. Do we have questions? Just seen Trump bitch about oil prices at UNGA. Thoughts? I saw something interesting about that. Well, I mean, my thoughts about Trump bitching about oil prices, the UN General Assembly is like, well, then gee whiz, I guess you shouldn't have blown up the fucking Iran deal. Um, Saudi Arabia has documented that it does have willingness to do what Trump says on this, but they have limited capacity to do what Trump says on this. At this point, I believe Saudi Arabia already has jacked up its production a good deal. And it could maybe add as much as $1 million, million barrels of oil a day. But if the shale patch starts falling apart, they're not going to be able to do 4 million more barrels of oil a day. And honestly, I think the Saudis are probably souring on Donald Trump a bit, realizing that, oh, wait, actually, we can't just shovel money at this guy and he'll do exactly what we want. Not that Trump, wouldn't want to do that, but there's just certain basics about, what the U.S. can really do at this point. I think that even the people at the Pentagon know that actually getting into a war with Iran at this point would be insane. Maybe, we could get into some kind of military engagement with Iran in Syria or Iraq. That seems much more likely to me. But I think Saudi Arabia thought that with Trump, they were going to get an invasion of Iran or something. And that's never been on the cards. So I think Saudi Arabia, the main U.S. tool against rising oil prices, has sort of run out of capacity is running out of capacity to flood the market with more oil. And B is probably running out of willingness as it realizes that its fantasy of destroyed Iran is less likely, and is also as the U.S. gets less supportive of its adventuring in Yemen. Nowhere near as less supportive as the U.S. should be, but there's that. Okay, that was Damn Rocks Dude with the just seen Trump bench about oil price UNGA thoughts. Bartos Zarnata asks, what is your take on rapid fall of Indian rupee against US dollar? I don't have one. I would document that, as I'd mentioned earlier, higher oil prices, even marginally higher oil prices, are terrible for India. And that's going to mean that demand for oil in India will fall, but also it means that it's just bad for a much more fragile country. I think India, in the era of low oil prices, has been able to get back to 7 to 8% GDP growth every year. But if one of their main inputs becomes much more expensive, that is a problem. So I think that the fall of Indian rupee against the US dollar is a straightforward, relatively straightforward sort of function of the oil price dynamics that I'm talking about here. The sort of the slow rise of the oil price over the past couple of years is really bad for India, and it's not bad for the U.S. or the U.S. economy. So the Indian rupee weakens and the U.S. dollar goes up. That's a dramatic oversimplification. Currency is always sort of a mystery to me, but I think that's sort of what is going on, what you're asking about, Bartos Zarnata. Okay. Do we have a question here? We're running out of questions. Pentagon, okay. Well, there seems to be a very involved conversation going on here, and I can't even tell what it's about. I'm going to go look for a few more questions. Tommy T asks, how much time does Pakistan have left? I'm going to have to do my standard Pakistan answer, which is, I don't know. I don't know anything about Pakistan. I wish I knew more. I need to read some books. If you recommend a good Pakistan book, that'd be great. I think one of my main problems covering India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan is I don't think you can really cover any of them without covering all of them. Pakistan and certainly India are just worlds of their own. There's so much going on in those countries, economically, ethnically, religiously, everythingly. And I just haven't done the research yet. I do hope to be able to get to a point where I can speak with any kind of authority on those countries, but I'm not there. So, Millination asks, any information from the United Nations meeting? I certainly doubt it. I did. I think I retweeted already at Rabo Law the amazing clip of Trump actually being laughed at by the people at the United Nations, which I definitely appreciated. Perhaps that's partisan of me, but for a guy who talks a lot about how people were laughing at Obama, he's the only U.S. president that people have physically laughed at in the UN General Assembly, which is completely deserved. But no, I don't expect much to come out of the UN meeting, but I'll follow the news. Let's see here. Dan C. asks, do you think when Maduro is gone and Venezuela becomes stable again, petro will plummet in price quickly? No, I do not think so. I think in the long term, yes. If Venezuela had a more sort of technocratic, internationally friendly country, I think that Venezuelan production could recover very quickly. But there was actually a point made in a lot of the comments that was very valuable to the Venezuela video that I did, is that Venezuelan oil is gross, apparently. There's a lot. It's somehow heavier. It requires more processing, this, that, and the other thing. So in a context, as we had in 2008, which sort of allowed Chavez to do all the Bolivarian revolution stuff that he wanted, where we're sort of desperate for oil everywhere, then yeah, Venezuela can make a ton of money. But in the sort of environment where we're at now, it's not just that Venezuela destroyed their state oil company. It's not just that folks are coming after them for debts and whatnot. It's also the fact that Venezuelan oil just isn't as attractive as other options that are more readily available in a low oil price context. So yes, I think that if Venezuela immediately got much better run, then that would make a oil spike much less likely, or guarantee that an oil spike would be briefer. Even under its current administration, if we got back up to 110, 120 dollars for a barrel of oil, then Venezuelan production would step up, not just because the Venezuelan government could make more money, but because some of the oil companies that are coming after them to shut down production at this point would change their tune very quickly. Like, hey, well, maybe we can settle all this if you give me a slice of this, that, and the other thing, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting question. And yeah, Venezuela has been a huge part of the rise in oil prices, but I think it's not quite as straightforward a function as you think. But I think you're probably right. Let me take it back. You're right. Okay. A more stable Venezuela would lead to a fall in oil prices. Okay. What do we got here? Questions. Got any questions down at the bottom? Yep. Okay, here we go. Tamar Al-Zubi asks, do you think Turkey will recover from its crisis anytime soon? No, I don't. I think that there's a lot more fallout to come. I had friends in the Turkish legal industry who said most of the work that they were doing, this is a couple months back, but most of the work they've been doing for the past year was like debt restructuring. And I don't think unless there's another worldwide financial crisis, I don't think the interest rate environment's going to change. I don't think the Fed's going to start easing up the money supply. So that means that sort of all these debts that are already being restructured in Turkey are very likely to come to some sort of default. So yeah, I think Turkey's got a lot more mess ahead of it, is my prediction. So yeah. Okay, Logo Cool Extreme asks, what are your thoughts on the Maldives election and correlation between both it and Malaysia's elections? Both former rulers had very close relationships with China and large one belt, one road plans. I think that's fascinating. And I think it sort of plays into the same, I had a video a couple months back about why the sort of death of democracy is completely exaggerated. It's sort of based on this, there's some problems with democracy in places like places that are sort of closer to the United States that we focus on a lot more, be it Europe or China or, well, I don't know, Washington frickin' DC. But actually, if you look out into the broader world and places where that the U.S. hasn't actively been screwing up, the main problem with European politics right now is the refugee crisis that U.S. policy in Libya and Syria created. If you look at places that the U.S. hasn't actively been screwing up or hasn't screwed up itself, actually democracy is doing pretty great. And the Maldives, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing Maldives election. Loga, I got to say, I try to cover everything and try to have a good opinion on everything. But before you sent me that Maldives article, was it yesterday, day before? I honestly didn't know much about the Maldives. I knew they existed. Couldn't have told you how many people lived there, what it was about. So I can't speak to the Maldives, though Loga's been helping me with Malaysia. I can't speak to the Maldives or Malaysia in any great detail. But I am happy to see that. And I think it both plays against this narrative that democracy is somehow disappearing and this narrative that China is, somehow taking over everywhere. And I think that's great. Mohammed Hossein Mohammed asks, why you think going to happen to the Iran regime? What do you think is going to happen to the Iran regime? I think the main thing shoring up the sort of theocratic Iranian regime at this point is U.S. opposition. I think that I think it was, John Coombs of Safe for Democracy, a guy I used to do sort of longer form talks with, talks about the way that the hardliners in the U.S. and the hardliners in Iran are each other's best allies, because it's only the opposition of the world's largest and most powerful, not largest, the world's most powerful country, the United States, that has kept Iran's quite lamentable political system going. The classic example that I talked about was Ahmadinejad, who was a guy who couldn't get elected to the Tehran City Council before George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech. In the Axis of Evil speech in 2002, Bush, quite unwisely, used the 9/11 attacks as an excuse to essentially declare war, not in a formal sense, but quite clearly declare a sort of undeclared war against Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And then he toppled Iraq, and thankfully it blew up in his face enough that he didn't make it to Iran and North Korea. So after that, after the Axis of Evil speech, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad went from a guy who couldn't get elected to the city council in Tehran to Tehran's mayor, and then to Tehran's prime minister, where he continued to say crazy shit that every neocon think tank in the United States talks about today, as if it's still happening, even though he got voted out, 5 or 6 years ago. So yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's unlikely, but I think it's possible that this sort of new round of pressure will work and the Iranian regime will fall. But the thing is that it's not going to be unified pressure. We saw yesterday that is something that came out of the UN General Assembly meeting, not the General Assembly, but sort of around it, is that representatives from Europe, China, and Russia got together to agree to keep buying Iranian oil. What Trump has succeeded in doing is shut down any sort of European rebuilding of Iran's economy and infrastructure. That's successfully been shut down because European countries are scared enough of the U.S. financial system. But it's not like I really don't feel that that Trump is going to be successful in meaningfully shutting down Iranian oil exports. So while we've successfully made the Iranian people more miserable, I don't think we will be able to shut down the regime with this sanction stuff, mostly because nobody likes Trump, because he's a piece of shit, and he made us all into liars by destroying the Iran deal. So yeah, I think the Iranian regime will probably survive, mostly because of U.S. opposition to the Iranian regime. I've got a video talking about how Hassan Rouhani, the current president, could have been Mikhail Gorbachev. He could have been. Gorbachev didn't think he was ending the Soviet Union. Rouhani certainly doesn't think he's ending the theocracy, but he could have been if we'd engaged them in the right way, if we'd engaged them the way that Reagan engaged Gorbachev. But we didn't. That's a missed opportunity. I think Trump has ensured that the Iranian regime will be around for another 10, 20 years. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it'll work. Maybe John Bolton actually knows a fucking thing. I doubt it. All right. How do you, Alexander Riegler asks, how do you think the European Union will continue to develop? I really need to get back to talking about EU. I specifically really want to talk about Northern Ireland and what that means for Brexit. I think that's really important. I've only done a couple videos on Europe this year, and I definitely stand by them, but I want to get back into it. I think my main EU video from this year is the European Union is running out of time, and I think that's very true. I think that Macron, who's now actually quite unpopular, might actually be sort of a last chance, the last pre-right-wing government of France. And if the Front National or some other Eurosceptic party gets in France, then that's a serious existential question for the European Union. What's interesting is the way, however, that a lot of Eurosceptic parties, like I think both the Five Star Movement in Italy and used to be the Northern League, but now I guess it's just Lega, the right-wing part of Italy's sort of insurgent government right now. Both of those parties were strongly Eurosceptic or anti-EU, but now that they're in power, they're like, well, actually, maybe we can totally work with the EU. So who knows? Maybe the European Union is more durable than I think it is, but I do think that it remains at serious risk. And I think people are getting way too confident about it because the EU has sort of finally just barely ticked over back into like 2% growth or whatever. So that's what I think about the EU. The U.S. Salah Asim asks, the U.S. has given the clean energy leadership to China. China is leader in solar energy. 7 of 10 panels are manufactured in China. Thoughts? I think that's true. And I think it's dumb the way that Trump has sort of acted around that, but I think it's also kind of overblown. Solar panels, manufacturing solar panels is important, but that's not, I mean, this is like saying China is the leader in clothing because it makes most of the textiles, which I don't think it does anymore, actually. That's kind of, making solar panels is kind of a low value sort of thing. What's more important is the installation and the technologies and this, that, and the other thing. Tesla would be a great example. Tesla's not just a car company. It's also driving a lot of innovation around solar panels. And, if the companies that are doing interesting innovations around the solar field and green energy, that's probably a little more important than the actual manufacturing. So I think that's a little overblown, this idea that China is the leader in solar energy now. I'd say that actually Tesla is still kind of a huge leader in solar energy. And I think, even if Tesla, the car company, evaporates, I think somebody smart is going to pick up the storage and solar remnants of Tesla and run with it pretty hard. So yeah, but yes, I absolutely agree that this whole Trump is hurting U.S. competitiveness in renewable energy markets, which is freaking dumb. Logo Cool Extreme asks, how much influence does the alt-right have in U.S. politics? I'd say, I don't know, man. Like the alt-right is just such a amorphous term. Who's in the alt-right? What is the alt-right? I mean, are we just talking about racism? Racism is super influential in U.S. politics. That's one of the really sad things is I still believe that, Trump's election absolutely had something to do with economic stuff, economic factors. A lot of people who explain that away sort of point out that, well, it's just, actually more Trump voters are richer. And, that whole, economic insecurity thing doesn't make sense. I don't believe that's true because with Obama as president, a lot of those rich people in the suburbs who tend to vote Republican thought that, thought Obama was a communist. He certainly wasn't, but, decided that Obama was not a safe person and they shouldn't invest their money in U.S. markets, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. I talk about this in the video on the Trump bump that I did 3 or 4 months back. So anyway, so what I'm saying is the whole like economic insecurity thing, I think was a factor, but also, yes, it's just freaking racism. We have Trump as president because we elected a black president, and a lot of people in the United States couldn't handle it. That's sad, but it's true. So yeah, racism is an important factor in U.S. politics. It'll always be an important factor in U.S. politics. It'll always be an important factor in everybody's politics all across the world. The question is how much of a factor, how much of a growing factor will it become? Are the Republicans going to turn into the racist party going forward? That's a serious possibility, actually. I do think that if economic growth continues, I get a little more optimistic. Generally, I think that a lot of this stuff tends to crop up, certainly in Europe. I think that in Europe, the right-wing populist, whatever parties, came out of the fact that the EU wasn't working economically. That's the main reason they came to power. And if things do continue to sort of rocket along or limp along in Europe, economically speaking, I think their appeal could fade. So yeah, I don't know if that's particularly helpful. I think the alt-right, I don't think anybody really describes themselves as alt-right anymore after Charlottesville, the sort of Unite the Right protest last year that ended up killing a person. I think that has sort of resulted in the alt-right moniker being sort of discarded. And interestingly, a lot of figures who sort of saw themselves as leading the alt-right have either been completely discarded themselves, like that Milo guy, or have actually sort of seen what they yielded and been a bit terrified and sort of run in the other direction. So yeah, I don't make much of a study of sort of alt-right, thinking and whatnot. I'm more interested in sort of the broader role that racism plays in our politics. So I'm not too invested in it. Goat Lover at Mo Freedom Foundation. How will Europe benefit from Iranian nuclear deal and why they want to save it despite USA threat? The Europeans want to save the Iran nuclear deal because it's a fantastic deal. I think what happens in U.S. politics is we have a lot of sort of military industrial complex types who are invested in holding the Iran nuclear deal to impossible standards. A lot of their arguments boil down to, well, wait a second, Iran has missiles. How is the Iran nuclear deal a success? Because the deal didn't cover missiles, jackass. Oh, wait a second, Iran has a foreign policy and gives some of the money that we gave them to Assad, who we don't like. Yeah, that wasn't covered in the deal, jackass. What the Europeans know, and most anybody who actually looks at the deal know, is that it did a tremendously effective effective job of hampering the scariest thing about Iran, its nuclear weapons program. China and Russia are also invested in there not being more nuclear powers. It's only Trump and his military-industrial complex masters who thought that getting rid of the Iran nuclear deal was a sane thing to do. One of my favorite data points that I keep quoting, and actually it's interesting because I now have trouble Googling the Haaretz article on this, but one of my favorite data points is actually the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, the guy who's actually invested in the continued security of Israel, wanted to keep the Iran nuclear deal. The Iran nuclear deal, when it's not judged against some pie-in-the-sky fantasy, but is actually judged against what you can reasonably expect out of a non-proliferation deal, was a fantastic deal. That's why Europe, Russia, China, and anybody with an ounce of sense in the world wanted to preserve it. And yes, also there's the benefits of cheaper oil if they continue buying stuff from Iran. Europe is really fucking pissed because they were doing much better out of the Iran nuclear deals, opening up of the Iranian economy than the United States was. The United States is still the great Satan. So you had French and German companies, Siemens, and I think Total, the French oil company, that lost a shit ton of money because Trump decided the United States didn't have to honor its obligations. So yeah, that's why Europe was trying to save the nuclear deal. Cletus223 asks, "What about the Alevists?" Which is, I assume, something from the discussion. I don't have context for that. Rahim El Mula says Obama is a war criminal, or Obama a war criminals. I think that's fair. Good luck prosecuting us. Fatel Gua asks, "Is Russia losing Central Asia to China?" Absolutely. That's a great, gosh, I really got to figure out how to, Fatel Guetta. Great commenter. I really should know how to pronounce his name appropriately by now. Is Russia losing Central Asia to China? Absolutely. There's no question. A lot of this sort of China has more influence, China's coming for us stuff. Some of it's true from the US context, but a lot of it is sort of fantasy. What's also an incredible fantasy is this idea that Russia and China would ever have anything in common or would somehow band together against, everybody else, have an alliance. It's laughable. Russia's backyard used to be Central Asia. Now it's China's backyard. Russia shares I think it's an over 1,000-mile, 2,000-mile border with China, including sections that Russia carved off from China after Hong Kong was carved away from China, like the Amur River region, and also those regions with very few Russians and a lot of Russian oil are right across the border from hundreds of millions of Chinese. Absolutely. Russia's planners, strategists, if they have an ounce of sense, should be terrified of China. I actually, there's a video I did a number of years back that, I'm not sure there'll be a European Union in 30 years, but it was why Russia will join the European Union within 30 years. It may not be, the EU might not exist. Unfortunately, it'll probably be NATO, but yeah, well, what we're dealing with right now with Russia versus Europe versus the United States is all just chair shuffling, and historically speaking, it's all just sort of preliminaries to it's sort of sorting out the details before Russia sort of joins Europe and probably the United States in sort of a larger grouping oriented, hopefully not against China, but certainly in sort of strategic competition with China. The idea that Russia and China are ever going to be pals is deeply stupid. Short term, maybe, yeah. Short term, yeah, like on a UN, sort of to stand up for sovereignty together, or veto the same things in the Security Council, sure. But this idea that there's going to be a long-term Russian-Chinese alliance, you have to not be able to read a map to believe that. So, Rahim Al-Mullah asks, "How the hell did that clown win the Nobel Prize for Peace?" Talking about Obama. Yeah, he won that because everybody really hated Bush, which seems kind of quaint now. The Nobel Peace Prize for Obama was obviously a tragedy, but what are you gonna do? Fadil Guerra asks, "When do you think post-Sisi Egypt is going to happen?" I don't know, but I'm pretty sure a post-Sisi Egypt is going to happen, and it's not going to be pretty. That could be next year. That could be 10 years from now. It could be 20 years from now. But when I see Sisi, the current sort of dictator of Egypt, all I see is the Shah of Iran. I think he's a really bad bet, and his repression will come back to haunt not just Egypt, but the world. So, yeah. Sangui says, "What do you think about the situation in Libya?" I was recently looking into that a bit, and it's pretty disturbing. And what bugs me the most about this is that it's almost like, God, if if these folks at the UN General Assembly, just the right decision makers, just sort of, maybe someone from France, someone from UAE, someone from Qatar, someone from Russia, someone from the US. Maybe if they all just sort of sat down together, they could resolve that situation very quickly. We've got this terrible situation where different constellations of outside actors are supporting one of three, is it three now, separate governments, and they're all just sort of, I mean, it's so profoundly sad, because it's a country of what, 4 or 5 million that's just been ripped to shreds for 6 years now, mostly because the world can't decide who they should put in charge. It's very sad. I haven't done the detail. I don't know the chapter and verse on Haftar, or which government is where exactly, or who's being supported by who at this point. But my not particularly expert view of that is, what the fuck? Why is this still a thing? Well, I mean, how dysfunctional is world governance that we can't just sort of get together to be like, support one guy, get some peace, get the oil out, get some money flowing in there. He won't be any, whoever the next dictator is, he won't be as bad as Gaddafi. It'll be a step forward for Libya. And hopefully once some peace and security has been established, we can start talking about democratization and a path forward. Yeah, that's my take on Libya. Fardel Guerra. I hope I can remember that, Fardel. Sangui says, and why do you think populism rises in Europe? It's because the US got into Syria and Libya. That's the main reason populism is rising in Europe. I think there's definitely some other anger about migrant populations that were present before, about the European Union's democratic deficit, about political correctness, all that, blah 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 blah. Sure, some of that existed there. The EU made a tremendous amount of missteps, and was bad about sovereignty and whatnot. But without the refugee crisis that was created by the U.S. destruction of Libya and Syria, we would not have right-wing anti-EU populist parties winning, 15 to 20% in votes across Europe. That's why populism rose in Europe, because the United States destroyed Libya and Syria, and that the fallout from that decision might end up destroying the European Union, and that's a goddamn shame. Logo Cool Extreme asks, can we non-Americans trust the United States to be a dependable ally? No. I mean, it depends on what you're depending on us for. You're depending on us for to make decisions that are generally in our economic interest. I think, yes, after we get past this, Trump thing, yeah, probably. But, can you rely on the United States to, I don't know, come to your defense, or, generally act as a good faith leader of the world? No. Well, maybe. I don't know. Because I think that acting in our own interest has been good for the world in general. I think that the U.S. Encouragement of sort of globalization and growth of business and economic development has been good for the world, and it's been the U.S. interest. But yeah, as far as day-to-day decisions, in favor of our allies, it's a crapshoot. So, yeah. Bartos Zonata asks, what is your take of the Chinese takeover of Zambia recently due to the famed debt trap? I don't know the details of Zambia. I should look into it. Thank you. I'm assuming it was because of a One Belt, One Road project that Zambia took on too much debt for and then was sort of forfeit. Don't know enough about it. Sorry. Rahim Al-Mulia says, I won't be surprised if Trump gave the Russians Alaska, honestly. Man, gosh, just to see Sarah Palin's face when that happens would be worthwhile, but I don't think that's going to happen. And also, yeah, there's sometimes it's oversold, but I think that if you actually look at U.S. policy towards Russia under Trump, there hasn't been, other than the stuff that Trump says, and who cares, there's been very little shift in policy in Russia's favor, and actually a fair amount against Russia. So yeah, we're not going to give them. Trump can try to give the Russians Alaska, but it's not going to happen. Abdullah Al Tayyib asks, "What do you think about Donald Trump's statements on drug trafficking and his perspective on Africa?" I don't really care what Donald Trump says. He's a moron. I think there's way too much. I think there's way too much time and effort invested in parsing the ridiculousness of whatever Trump says. I think more time should be invested in looking at what the people who work for him are actually doing with our government, which is much more interesting and much more important. But yeah, Trump's statements, he's a reality TV show star who doesn't know much about the world, who somehow ended up in the most powerful position in the world. That doesn't mean he's someone worth listening to. Yeah, Tammy T points out, you can't trust the United States, but there are no better options. And I think that's very true. Tanus asks, what do you think of the S-300 missile system in Syria? I'd be a little surprised if it had actually got deployed. My understanding is that after the Syrians shot down a Russian plane due to supposedly Israeli interference, Russia is considering deploying its more advanced anti-aircraft stuff to Syria so that it could be used against Israel, United States, what have you. I don't know. Has that already happened? I don't know the details. I do know that we sort of talk about the S-400s in Turkey a lot, which is this sort of famed turn away, Turkey's turning away from the United States and buying weapons from Russia. But, that's supposed to maybe happen in 2020 or something, by which point I could easily see Russia and Turkey, actually physically fighting each other over Syria. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't have any particular... I think Syria largely the fighting is over. I thought I was going to get another one of my predictions wrong. I think a couple months back I had said that Idlib was unlikely to be invaded because of Turkish troops. 2 to 3 weeks ago, it looked like I was going to be completely wrong about that. And who knows, it could look like that again today. Perhaps Idlib has been invaded. I haven't Google News Syria today yet. But it looks like Idlib is going to stand. I think that fighting may be dying down in Syria. So I don't know. Last question, please don't ignore it, from Goat Lover. What are Zionists up to? I have a video that I came out with 2 weeks back talking about does Israel run the U.S. foreign policy? I suggest you watch that, and I'd also suggest you read a Medium post on Israel and anti-Semitism that I left in the description of that video. That is my pretty definitive take on the Zionists. I believe that a sort of Israel lobby exists and is powerful in the United States government, but it is nowhere near as powerful as the military-industrial complex lobby, powerful, multifaceted, never-ending lobby that has much more to do with how U.S. foreign policy works than Israel. I think that Israel and Israel's current leadership are just one facet of a broader policy of fostering instability that helps the United States sell weapons. I think it's quite straightforward, actually. So yeah, you can check out that video and read that Medium post, and you'll have my current position on the Zionists. Yeah, there is an Israel lobby, but there are also hundreds, thousands of other lobbies that are. There are dozens that are more important than the Israel lobby, and there are thousands of lobbies. Yeah, I think this whole idea that the Zionists run the U.S. government is wrong. Okay. Why are you so nonchalant? Logos Cool Extreme asks, why are you so nonchalant about Jeff Sessions getting fired? Do you want Rudy Giuliani to be Attorney General? Yeah, I'm very nonchalant about Jeff Sessions getting fired. I'm excited about Jeff Sessions being fired because I would never be a single issue voter, but what I care about, even though it's not been reflected in my channel recently that much, more than anything else in U.S. domestic politics is mass incarceration and the racist criminal justice system in the United States. I've got a 40 video series on that you can find in the playlists thing in my channel. One of the reasons that I haven't done much on this topic in the last 2 or 3 years is that since Ferguson and since the sort of advent of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think the real progress has been being made. And I think hopefully at some point in the next year or so, I'll be able to do some updates on that. But like it's amazing the progress that's being made. There's bipartisan support for sentencing reform and this, that, and the other thing. And Trump and Sessions are just a massive dump in the middle of that progress. They are doing their best to stop it, to roll it back, to bring back the bad old days of mass incarceration in the 1980s. And now Trump is for all that sort of thing, very clearly, sort of a racist schmuck who believes that black people should be, seen but not heard. They can play on sports, but they're not allowed to have opinions or do things. But he's also a moron with no concept of how to actually carry out what he thinks. Jeff Sessions is the guy who knows how to carry out those racist instincts. He's the guy in government, one of the most powerful people in government, who still believes in that 1980s vision of the world where, black people are just here to kill us and this, that, and the other thing. And there was a famous impression of him done on Saturday Night Live where, he sort of gets up there and says, there's two kinds of crime. There's black crime and everybody else's crime. And he really seems to believe that and that's a parody, but he really seems to believe that and is carrying out an agenda for that. Would Rudy Giuliani do the same thing? Sure, but I think you're also leaving out the, I'd say, really, I think the real possibility of sort of a constitutional crisis over trying to get a new attorney general in there. I think that's a constitutional crisis and fight, unlike the Supreme Court thing, that I'd be eager to have. So yeah, getting Jeff Sessions out of government is worth, as I put in the video, I'm not very optimistic about the results of the Mueller investigation anyway. This video on that from the last month or two. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy to see Jeff Sessions go. And if his successor was appointed, then chose to fire the special counsel, then I think Trump would be in a lot of trouble. And that sounds fine by me. So yeah, that's why I'm happy to see Sessions go. Fardel Guerra asks, is Japanese discovery of rare earth minerals going to end China's monopoly on rare earth minerals? I don't know. I think this question has been asked before, actually. And I think that as with any one commodity, I think I'm guilty of this with my coverage of petroleum stuff and the way that I talk about just oil when I should be talking about oil, natural gas, and the differences in these different kinds of products from different countries. There's a tendency, I think, with oil, it's a little more valid. And I think hopefully people understand that I am talking about a broader petroleum industry, not just like, this direct line from Saudi Arabia to our gas pumps or anything like that. And I think with the rare earth thing, I think there's a lot of complexity that also gets sort of explained away. It's like, yes, China does have a monopoly on certain rare earth minerals, but we're sort of dealing with something where there's a lot more potential for innovation. As Fardel points out, the Japanese discovered a whole bunch of rare earth minerals as well, but are they the right ones? And I think also more generally, if there's a market for these things, people will sell them, even if a certain country has a weird monopoly on them. I think it's great that Japan has found another source for some of these materials. And I think it'll be a number of years before large-term production actually comes on stream. But I'm not sure I was really ever a big believer in this idea that China was going to hold up or stop the development of cell phones or electric cars because they had all the rare earths. When people have a monopoly on something, they generally keep selling it. Okay. Questions. Mehmet Akhtar asks, what are the most important lobbies according to me? Oh, that's a great question. I would say, first and foremost, probably the military-industrial complex lobby. Not because they, and what's important about this, and it's something I want to work with, certainly in the book that I'm writing, but also in the next project, is that the military-industrial complex lobby is tremendously powerful because of its access. There is a broader thing. It provides technology, it provides jobs, this, that, and the other thing. But it's much more powerful than it needs to be because of the ways that it sort of accesses Congress folks and the ways that the arms industry functions. I've already talked about that a lot in my military industrial complex playlist, which I believe is the first thing. So I think that's still the most powerful lobby. The AARP is actually, yeah, the American Associated of Retired People. The AARP is probably the most important factor in U.S. politics and will be forever. When you turn 55 in the United States, you get a card, and I think they start soliciting donations from the American Association of Retired People. That card gets you all kinds of benefits and this, that, and the other thing. Old people vote. Old people vote more than young people. Old people have more spare time to invest in politics, this, that, and the other thing. Old people have the time to write angry letters and call their congresspeople. The American Association of Retired People, the old people lobby, is probably the most powerful in the United States. That's one example. There's a whole range of industry lobbies. I'd say Wall Street is a really powerful lobby for sure. Now, of course, all of these lobbies sort of can filter into each other, like, I'm sure there's people here who just be most terrified by a, old Jewish person in Florida who used to be in banking. That's a powerful freaking individual. But none of these lobbies, sort of that diffusion and intermixing between these lobbies, also leads to a diffusion and intermixing of their goals. So, say you've got this, old Jewish former banker in Florida, what's he going to be most interested in? Where's he going to be most concerned? If you've got, some guy who's not very pro-Israel, but is really good at defending Medicare, or really, good at making sure that he doesn't have to do anything different with his zoning board or something like that, then, maybe I'll vote for that guy instead, or maybe I'll, send him my $2,500 in donations instead. So I think all of this is a lot more complex. So yeah, you've got your defense industries. You've got the AARP itself. Like, that's actually an established organization with lobbying. That is probably the American Association of Retired People, probably the most powerful lobby in the country. That's why things like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid are pretty untouchable. You've got the Republicans have desperately, Bush actually tried to do this, have desperately been trying to privatize Social Security for like 10, 15 years now. Never going to do it because of the AARP. Finance, Wall Street. I should know there are some bigger organizations. Basically, every industry in the United States has a national association of something. The National Association of Home Builders probably have something to do with the financial crisis in 2008 because, they wanted policies that were good for home builders. There's a national association for everything that has tremendous amounts of impact. And I mean, I could talk about this for hours. But the point is, there are all these lobbies. These lobbies all exist. Many of them are much more powerful than the Israel lobby or Jewish lobby. Also, it's important to note that the Israel lobby or Jewish lobby is a diffuse thing itself. IPAC, the American, is it the Association of Conference or something? IPAC, AIPAC, I forget them, is the most famous Israel lobby group, but there are other groups that lobby around Israel policy. I mean, gosh, probably the Council on American Islamic Relations probably does some lobbying around Israel, but not much, that have different views of what's appropriate. Yes, there's definitely like a larger, as I talk about the larger, metastasized military industrial complex lobby, how you can really just sort of see all of these defense companies, academic institutions, think tanks, writers for places like the Atlantic, or really any large outlet. You can see all these people sort of pulling in the same direction. There are definitely a whole bunch of organizations that pull in the same direction as IPAC, towards a more stereotypical version of what the Israel lobby is. But there are other people who are pulling in other directions. So I'm just trying to say that it's confusing. I'm not confusing. There's just a lot more to U.S. politics than the very simple story of the Israel lobby or Jewish lobby that gets put forward. And I hope my blathering about the American Associated of Retired People has been helpful in that. Oh yeah, so I was saying, I also didn't think I finished. Bush Republicans have always wanted to, privatize Social Security. They're never going to be able to do it because of the AARP. Oh wow, shouldn't be dropping that kind of language in here, Rahim El Mullah. Logo Cool Extreme asks, does the word constitutional crisis even mean anything anymore? Which I think is a very logical form of frustration to be going through at this point. We certainly hear a lot about that, and it's kind of ridiculous. But no, I think constitutional crisis is a very real thing, and a very real thing that we could be going through in the United States. We'll see. Let's see. Fadel Guerra asks, will future Republican presidential candidates base their campaigns on Trump's? I think yes in the short term, and I think in the long term, no. Because, as I've talked about before, I really do think, it's fun to watch Beto O'Rourke. He's the guy who's challenging Ted Cruz for his Senate seat in Texas. Pretty sure he's going to lose. Yeah, guy's going to lose. But it's also been interesting watching the hoops that Ted Cruz has gone through to fight against that challenge. And yes, O'Rourke is a above normal attractive candidate, an interesting guy, and he's had a lot of the right support. But it's not like Texas is going to run out of interesting Democrats with a lot of national support. I really do think that Texas is going to be turning blue fairly shortly. I don't think it's actually for demographic reasons. I just think because Texas is a big, rich place with lots of economic activity, and more of the Republican policies are against that sort of thing. They're anti-free trade. They're anti, people of color. They're anti-immigration and diversity and economic dynamism. So that kind of Trump candidate, has got another 4 to 6 years to 8 years before the Republicans lose Texas. And after that, I think you're very quickly going to see the Republican Party, if it's at all interested in, retaining real national influence, discarding a lot of the Trump stuff. I think they'll go back. There'll still be absolutely sort of racist elements to the Trump successors, but I think they're going to go very quickly back into dog whistle territory and not, actually making the subtext text. You have Ted Cruz. I think some of you probably saw this on Twitter. Beto O'Rourke. I think many of you are aware of this horrific situation where an off-duty Dallas, Texas police officer, supposedly mistaking a neighbor's apartment for her own, broke in and shot the African-American man who lived there in his own home. And she's been fired, thankfully, and will hopefully go to jail. But I believe Beto O'Rourke, Ted Cruz's challenger for the Senate, went down to a African-American church and, in a very rousing way, said a number of things about how terrible it was that this had happened and that he hoped that this woman was prosecuted. And Ted Cruz just tweeted that out, saying, with the assumption that would be good for him. So basically, that's just explicitly Ted Cruz, sort of Republican standard bearer, the guy who was like our last hope to avoid the Trump nomination in 2016, just basically being like, yep, I'm a racist trying to appeal to racists to win. I mean, just it's extraordinary. So yeah, I think we're going to see a lot less of that a decade from now. But it's something we'll have for the next 2 to 4 years. Highly Evil, great handle, asks, what are your thoughts on the two-party system in the United States? Is it here to stay? Unfortunately, yes, I believe it is. Wrote an essay called "Throw Away Your Vote." When I started this channel, I actually intended it to spend a lot of time advocating for third-party candidates. Unfortunately, by the time 2016 actually rolled around, we were dealing with Trump. So one of my most popular early videos was a very anti-Clinton video, and I had a very anti-Jeb Bush video. But Trump, I think, really does become something so threatening that I think I don't like it, but I support the Democrats. So, yeah, my expectation was that there would be a Trump-like figure who would run as a third party, and then major parties would sort of try to adopt his policies. But yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I'm a historic big supporter of third parties. But even when I was a supporter of third parties, I thought that the Democrats and Republicans would stick around for a while. It was just that we could use third parties to influence them. I think they've already been pretty soundly influenced. So yeah, the Democrats and Republicans are probably here to stay. Yes, Tommy T points out Trump is your third party candidate. Yep, that's pretty horrifying. So yeah, I think it's Republicans and Democrats going to keep going. All right, folks. So we're closing in on 2 hours. I've found that when I go over the 2 hour mark, people just sort of psychologically become less likely to click on it going, after the fact. So I think I should probably call it here at pretty much the 2 hour mark, before the 2 hour mark. Thank you guys so much for watching and participating and being a part of this. I'm really excited that I actually got that stuff out there. I've been thinking about it for a while, and who knows, there may be more. I may put some produced videos together on the topic of electric cars. I think it's really interesting the way that just the facts of electric cars have shifted over the past 5 years, and people haven't been paying attention. But yeah, so I think I'm going to have to close out. My name is Robert Morris. I am the More Freedom Foundation. I'd be tremendously grateful if you considered helping keeping this going, either through contributing directly through PayPal or by participating in my crowdfunding thing on Patreon. I can be found on Twitter at RoboLaw. I can be found on Instagram at The Golden Age. And all of these accounts are linked on the front page of the YouTube channel if you just click on About. I sell a number of essays that go into more depth about the thinking on this channel. I think probably the best of them is Everybody's Lying About Islam, that deals a lot with Saudi Arabia and Islamophobia in the United States. And I am still working on Avoiding the British Empire, which should just try to explain everything and how the United States can avoid collapsing with apocalyptic world wars like the British Empire did. So okay, I think that's everything. All right, thank you so much, and thank you for joining me. And I think I am going to say goodbye. Stop broadcast. Many thanks.